1 in 4. Just think about that number. By 2020, 1 out of every 4 American teenage girls had experienced a major depressive episode in the last year.
And it didn't stop there. Disturbingly, the numbers actually climbed higher in 2021.
Exactly. It's really chilling. And it makes you ask, what on earth is going on?
It really forces us to look deeper, doesn't it? To try and understand the roots of this crisis.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And that's what we're doing today. We're taking a deep dive into Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation. Haidt makes this really powerful case that something fundamental shifted around 2010 to 2015. He calls it the great rewiring of childhood.
Driven by smartphones, social media, that basically a radical change in how kids grew up.
Right. And his core idea is that this rewiring is a major, maybe the major reason we're seeing so much more anxiety and depression in Gen Z kids born after 1995.
It's interesting, too, how he notes that even with Gen Alpha, those born after 2010, this anxious generation dynamic kind of continues until childhood itself changes again.
Yeah, it's less about the birth year cutoff and more about the conditions they're growing up in.
A really compelling argument. It suggests these tech and societal changes have just fundamentally altered the landscape for development.
Totally. So in this deep dive, we want to pull out the key insights from Haidt's analysis for you, our listener, to really help understand this huge shift and what it means.
And he brings together a lot of different perspectives, doesn't he?
He really does. Social psychology, developmental psychology, even looking back at older traditions. It gives this very rounded view.
That multi-angled approach is so important for getting a handle on something this complex, I think.
Okay, so let's get right into it. This great rewiring. What does Haidt actually mean by that?
Well, as Haidt lays it out, it's kind of a 1-2 punch. The first part is this huge change in how kids were interacting with technology. Specifically, smartphones and social media becoming ubiquitous.
It wasn't just gradual, though, was it?
No, not at all. It was really a convergence of things around 2009. You suddenly had high-speed internet pretty much everywhere. Right. The iPhone had arrived a couple of years earlier, setting the stage. And then social media became, as Haidt puts it, hyper-viralized.
Hyper-viralized, meaning
Content could just explode, spread incredibly fast, way beyond who you initially shared it with. And things like the like button, the retweet button, they popped up around 2009, too.
Okay. And those little buttons, they seem small, but they really changed the game, didn't they?
Massively. Haidt argues they turned social interaction online into this constant public performance, always being judged, rated. It added this layer of pressure and potentially toxicity that wasn't there before in the same way.
Yeah, I could see that. It went from just sharing stuff with friends to this global feedback loop.
Exactly. And then just a little later came a couple more things that really impacted girls, Haidt points out. Around 2010, you get front-facing cameras on phones.
The selfie camera.
The selfie camera, yeah. And then Facebook buys Instagram in 2012.
Right, which became huge for image sharing.
Huge. So suddenly, posting images of yourself, comparing yourself to others visually, it just skyrocketed among teens, especially girls. This constant curation and comparison became a central part of adolescence.
It's almost hard to overstate the impact of the selfie and that curated online life, especially during those really vulnerable teen years. The pressure must be immense.
It's intense, but that's only half of the rewiring equation, according to Haidt.
Okay, what's the other half?
The other side is this shift, maybe well-intentioned, towards overprotecting kids in the real world, really limiting their independence and autonomy.
Ah, yeah. This started earlier, right? Like the 80s and 90s.
Exactly. It really gained momentum then. Think about the rise of stranger danger fears.
Oh, absolutely. I remember that being everywhere. A sense that the world outside was suddenly much scarier for kids.
Right. And whether those fears were fully justified or maybe amplified by media, the result was clear. A huge drop in kids playing outside unsupervised.
Less walking to school alone. Less just roaming the neighborhood with friends.
Much less. Less of that unstructured, kid-driven exploration and play that used to be, well, normal.
So kids are losing that real-world freedom and experience.
At the same time, they're gaining this massive, absorbing virtual world. And this leads Haidt to this really striking analogy.
Okay.
He says Gen Z are basically like test subjects for a radical new way of growing up. They're far removed from the small group, real-world interactions humans evolved for. It's like, he says they're the first generation raised on Mars.
Wow, raised on Mars. That really paints a picture of how different their environment is.
It highlights the scale of the change, doesn't it? A completely different developmental habitat, in a way.
So, okay, we've got this huge shift. More online time, less real-world independence. How does Haidt connect this directly to that mental health crisis we started with?
Well, the timing is key. He points to data, like figure 1.1 in his book, showing this really sudden and very large upturn in major depression among U.S. teens ages 12-17.
And when did that upturn start?
Right around 2012, it wasn't a slow creep, it's a sharp bend upwards, like a hockey stick graph.
And this is based on teens reporting their own experiences.
Correct. Self-reported data reflecting how they're actually feeling. And while more girls reported depression in sheer numbers, the relative increase, the percentage jump from 2010 levels, was actually pretty similar for both boys and girls, about 150% increase for both.
So depression became like 2.5 times more common.
For both.
Roughly, yes.
Yeah.
And importantly, this happened across the board, all races, all socioeconomic classes. It wasn't just one group being affected.
And crucially, this sharp rise started before the pandemic hit, right? Because COVID gets blamed for a lot of recent mental health issues.
Absolutely critical point. Yes, the pandemic certainly didn't help, and things did worsen further in 2021, according to the data. But the vast majority of this huge increase in teen depression happened before 2020.
So whatever was driving this started well before COVID lockdowns. Definitely. It points back to these deeper shifts. Haidt is talking about the rewiring as the likely primary drivers. That initial scary statistic seems tied into these earlier changes.
Okay, so the rewiring happens, mental health tanks. Haidt uses this term, experience blockers. What are those?
Right, experience blockers. It's a core concept. He argues that both things, the overprotection in the real world and the constant pull of smartphones, act to block kids from having experiences that are vital for development.
Okay, like what kind of experiences?
Let's start with free play. Haidt stresses, and tons of research backs this up, that free, unstructured play is absolutely essential for brain development in mammals, including us.
How so?
It's how young minds learn crucial social skills, cognitive abilities, emotional regulation, figuring things out through trial and error in a low-stakes way. Think about kittens play fighting. They're learning to hunt, to interact.
Or kids playing tag, learning boundaries, negotiation.
Exactly. They're practicing life skills. Peter Gray, who's a big researcher on play, says something really interesting. Play actually requires you to suppress the urge to dominate. It teaches cooperation, helps form lasting bonds.
Huh. So play isn't just frivolous. It's fundamental training for social life.
Absolutely fundamental. So when kids get way less free play,
they miss out on that vital training.
They do. Haidt uses this analogy. Imagine instead of letting babies practice walking, we just gave them iPads with videos about walking.
Huh. They'd see it, but they wouldn't learn to actually do it. They wouldn't build the muscles, the balance.
Precisely. The decline in free play happening alongside the rise in screen time means kids are missing that essential hands-on embodied learning.
And how do the phones themselves act as experience blockers?
Well, think about the nature of the online world versus the real world. Online is often disembodied. You don't see body language. It's asynchronous. You can respond hours later. It's often one-to-many, like posting to hundreds of followers. And it's easy to just leave an interaction if it gets awkward.
Right. Very different from face-to-face.
Very different. Real-world interaction is where you really learn the tricky stuff. Reading nonverbal cues, managing ongoing relationships, handling difficult emotions in real time. If kids spend huge chunks of time online instead,
they just don't get as much practice with those essential real-world skills.
Exactly. So for you listening, you can see how this shift directly impacts the development of basic social competence. Even if the online content was harmless, the sheer time displacement is a problem.
The time spent on screens is time not spent having those developmental experiences.
That's the core of the experience blocker idea.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about how kids learn social rules and values? How does social media fit in or maybe interfere with that?
Yeah, this is another key piece. Haidt talks about how humans have these innate learning programs for culture. Two big ones are conformist bias.
Meaning?
Basically, copying what seems common or popular in your group, doing what everyone else is doing. And the other is prestige bias, copying people who seem successful, skilled, or admired. And he notes Joe Henrich's work distinguishing this from just raw dominance. It's about admiring skill, not just power.
So we're naturally wired to learn from popular trends and respected figures around us.
Exactly. We look to our peers, our parents, our teachers, our local community figures to figure out how to behave, what's valued.
But social media changes who those figures are.
Potentially, yes. Haidt argues that because these platforms are designed purely for engagement to keep your eyeballs glued, they can hijack these biases. Kids might end up focusing way more on online influencers whose prestige might be totally manufactured.
And whose values might be very different from their family or local community.
Right. The platform's algorithms might promote content or figures that are engaging, but not necessarily.
Well, good role models. It can kind of drown out the local culture.
And does the way we interact online affect this too? He argues it does. The fact that it's often asynchronous, performative, you're crafting an image rather than having a spontaneous back and forth, can get in the way of developing real social attunement. You know, that intuitive sense of the other person's feelings and intentions.
That serve and return dynamic you get face to face.
Exactly. And ironically, Haidt notes, heavy social media users can end up feeling more socially isolated, even though they're technically connected all the time.
That paradox of connection and loneliness. Wow. Okay, and the timing of all this seems critical too. Kids getting smartphones during puberty, how does that link to brain development?
This is huge. Haidt really emphasizes that adolescence, puberty, is this period of incredibly intense brain reorganization. It's second only to maybe the first couple of years of life in terms of how rapidly the brain is changing.
What's actually happening in the brain then?
Key processes like neural pruning, getting rid of unused connections, and myelination, insulating the connections you use, often to make them faster, more efficient. The brain is literally sculpting itself based on experience.
So what you do during your teens physically shapes your brain structure.
Absolutely. That old saying, neurons that fire together wire together, is especially true during adolescence. Experiences, particularly rewarding ones, carve pathways in the brain.
Okay. And the average age for getting a first smartphone is?
Around 11 in the U.S., right smack in the middle of this sensitive period.
So just as their brains are undergoing this massive, experience-driven rewiring,
they get plunged into what Haidt calls this whirlpool of adult content and experiences that arrive in no particular order.
Whoa, that sounds chaotic compared to how kids used to encounter the complexities of the world more gradually.
Exactly. And Haidt suggests this mismatch between the adolescent brain that's experience expectant, ready to learn from the environment, and this overwhelming, often inappropriate virtual environment could be a key reason Gen Z's mental health outcomes seem worse than, say, millennials.
Because millennials got this tech a bit later in their development.
Generally, yes. They weren't typically immersed quite so young during that peak window of brain plasticity. The constant stimulation, the social pressure, the potential negativity online, it might just hit harder and have more lasting effects when encountered at age 11 or 12.
It really does paint a concerning picture when you put all those pieces together. So just to quickly recap for you, the listener, we've covered Haidt's idea of the great rewiring, that combo of the phone-based childhood and the overprotected real world.
Right, and how that coincides with this alarming spike in teen anxiety and depression starting well before COVID.
We talked about how phones and overprotection can act as experience blockers, robbing kids of vital play and real-world learning.
And how social media can potentially warp natural social learning, focusing attention on maybe questionable online prestige.
And finally, the critical timing all this, hitting kids right during that crucial window of adolescent brain development.
It's a lot of interconnected factors, definitely. But seeing how they link together is crucial for understanding the challenge.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it brings us back to that shocking statistic we started with.
1 in 4 teen girls experiencing a major depressive episode by 2020, and it got worse. It's a stark reminder of the stakes here.
It really is. And it leaves us, and hopefully you, with a pretty big final thought to chew on. What does it mean for a whole generation to have their formative years shaped so profoundly by these shifts?
Yeah, what are the long-term consequences for individuals and for society? And maybe what can we actually do about it now to help foster healthier development for kids coming up?
Definitely questions worth exploring further. This deep dive into Haidt's The Anxious Generation really just scratches the surface. We absolutely encourage you to check out the book itself and keep thinking about these vital issues. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.